News Now.
So to begin, let's have an overview of the state of relations between the United States and Venezuela. And we've had lots of tension that has existed for decades across several American administrations. However, it has escalated to a significant military conflict involving American attacks on Venezuelan boats in the Caribbean to thwart drug trafficking at the beginning of the second Trump administration, with now we have a movement towards a regime change with a direct military attack by the United States to seize the Venezuelan president. So the initial phase of this conflict, this most recent conflict in the last few months, was marked by diplomatic threats and economic sanctions that then escalated when the United States military launched a wave of attacks against drug boats to disrupt trafficking networks moving drugs from South America to the United States. Beginning in early September, these strikes have resulted in approximately 80 fatalities across 20 separate incidents, targeting everything from speedboats to semi-submersible vehicles. The Trump administration has claimed that these operations are essential to stem the flow of drugs into the United States. Critics challenge these claims, arguing that strikes often occurred in ambiguous legal circumstances, with some vehicles reportedly retreating or operating outside U.S. territory. Just last night, there was a story in the New York Times that the planes that had been used in these attacks were not military, well, they were disguised as civilian planes, which potentially violates international laws of war. The Trump administration official justification centers on counter-narcotics and the role of the Venezuela's president, Maduro, in facilitating drug shipments to the United States. It's important to note here that the Southern District of New York secured a federal indictment of Maduro in March of 2020 during the first Trump administration, alleging that Maduro had engaged in narco-terrorism through the his leadership of a trafficking cartel, the Cartel of the Suns, that facilitated the flow of cocaine from Colombia to Venezuela and then to the United States.
So the most visible military part of this initial escalation of the attacks on the suspected drug boats was the deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford, which is a naval carrier, and strike group in the Caribbean. And that move signaled both a show of force and a clear message of U.S. resolve. The Venezuelan government then responded last week by mobilizing, well, a few weeks ago, by mobilizing 200,000 soldiers to prepare for what they thought was a emergent conflict. Now again, the administration consistently characterized these military actions, this before the actual attack on Venezuela, as a drug interdiction effort, and it was designed to dramatically decrease the flow of illegal narcotics to the United States. Trump's advisors have described these drug flows as a threat to national security, and this is an important point here, because the national security threat here was the large number of drug overdoses deaths that occur in the United States, which can have totaled over 100,000 deaths per year. Now, by portraying the Venezuelan government as complicit in drug trafficking and terrorism, the White House has sought to legitimize military intervention and rally domestic political support inside the United States for more ambitious military actions, right? And so they're trying to make this not just a foreign policy issue, but kind of an emotional and even ethical issue of trying to stop the flow of drugs. And the framing also isolated Maduro internationally, painting his regime as a criminal enterprise rather than a legitimate government. And so this narrative of narco-terrorism has been used to justify not only the military strikes, but broader efforts to disrupt drug trafficking.
So now we're going to move on to a discussion of the direct military intervention of Venezuela itself. The military campaign against suspected Venezuelan drug boats was ratcheted up dramatically in the early morning hours of January 3rd, when the U.S. military launched an attack on the Venezuelan mainland, and special forces, along with American law enforcement officers captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife. Interesting, the Secretary of State emphasized this in the initial press conference. He says this is a legal effort. This is a legal capture effort. This is a drug enforcement operation. So we're going to start this section with a clip from the PBS News Hour. Let's roll that clip now.
There are moments in time when history possibly pivots, and today, in a stunning act of regime change, the U.S. military captured and brought Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro to U.S. soil. Not long after that, in a remarkable declaration, President Trump announced the U.S. would, quote, run Venezuela, and warned of a new era of United States domination over Latin America. We will get an on-the-ground report from Venezuela's capital, Caracas, in a moment, but we begin our coverage with Nick Schifrin.
It was just after midnight over Caracas when U.S. helicopters with Delta Force soldiers descended toward Nicolas Maduro's compound. Nearby residents filmed and cowered from U.S. strikes on at least 4 locations. All part of the mission to capture and extract Maduro. By 2 a.m. local, they had him, and by 3 a.m. he was shackled aboard the USS Iwo the dictator-turned-detainee of the U.S. Department of Justice. U.S. military officials said U.S. helicopters took fire as they left Venezuela, but remained able to fly. A source familiar tells PBS NewsHour a small CIA team arrived in August and created extraordinary insight into Maduro's pattern of life that made grabbing him seamless.
This was one of the most stunning, effective, and powerful displays of American military might and competence.
So first, let us note that this military action, which was called Operation Absolute Resolve.
Absolute resolve,
Not just resolve. Absolute Resolve was a surprise. Although President Trump had threatened to remove Maduro from power and had built up U.S. military forces in the Caribbean, the mission itself to capture and extract the president was unexpected. A lot of people thought that this was cheap talk signaling designed to get concessions. Many commentators thought it was unlikely, and some even claimed it was, quote, impossible that the Trump administration would launch a large-scale military attack on Venezuela, given Trump's long-time criticisms of military interventions conducted by previous administrations, which he had said led to, quote, forever wars. The attack apparently was also a surprise to Maduro and the Venezuelan military as well. According to the New York Times, Maduro tried to avoid an American attack, offering the United States access to Venezuelan oil. The deal would have included the demand that Maduro leave the country with safe passage to Turkey. However, Maduro ultimately rejected that compromise on December 23rd. This led the Trump administration to move ahead with the plan to remove Maduro from power with force. President Trump authorized the military to go ahead with the mission as early as December 25th.
Merry Christmas.
Yeah, officials wanted to conduct the operation over the holiday period because many Venezuelan government officials were on vacation. Military personnel were also on leave, so that was intentional. It was bad weather that postponed it until after the new year.
All right, second, this was a large-scale attack. It was sophisticated, and it was successful. It achieved its immediate goal of capturing President Maduro and transporting him to face criminal charges in the United States without incurring any American casualties. Now, more than 150 military aircraft, including drones and fighter planes and bombers, took part in the mission, and they took off from 20 different military bases and Navy ships. And so this was a large-scale military operation.
Well, and I think it's also important to emphasize how successful it was and the lessons that that success had on other leaders around the world.
Right.
Because within a few days, Trump is talking on Air Force One and suggests that maybe we're going to do the same thing in Colombia. And all of a sudden, there's panic on the part of the Colombian administration, the Colombian president, that he might be next.
Right. There's talk about Cuba too.
Yeah.
Right. And so we're going to get into some of the details here right now and how sophisticated this was. The United States is pretty good at this, and they have been for a long time. I mean, that the attack that killed Osama bin Laden was similar in nature like this. And so how did they do it? The mission began with a U.S. cyber attack that cut power to large parts of the capital, Caracas, and left the city in darkness. This allowed U.S. planes and drones and helicopters to fly to their targets relatively undetected. Next, then, the fighter planes and bombers and drones that approached the city destroyed the country's air defenses, and that cleared a safe pathway for the helicopters that carried the special operations forces that were tasked with capturing Maduro. So there was this broader attack on infrastructure and targets in Venezuela, but it was all designed to get this one team to the place where Maduro was. Now, Maduro had been anticipating this, and so he was changing locations all the time, trying to avoid being in the same place on the same night and things like that. So how did they find Maduro? Well, the military knew where to locate Nicolas Maduro because back in August of 2025, there was a team of CIA officers that entered Venezuela clandestinely, and their task was to collect information on the Venezuelan president. And this operation used the CIA task force and officers, plus drones, and even a secret embedded human source within Maduro's inner circle to track this guy's daily movements. And that story I was saying is that they got down to like what his pits were and how he interacted with everything he did. I mean, they had eyes on this guy, and this intelligence then allowed the special forces to know exactly which compound to find Maduro on the night of the attack. And prior to this, to get ready, they picked the compound that they wanted to grab him from, and then they built it in, I don't know, I think Florida somewhere or something like that, and practiced over and over again about how to get him. And so this was, again, a huge operation. And once the forces entered the building, then they knew exactly where to go and find Maduro. And it was just a matter of minutes before they were at Maduro in apprehending him. And according to officials in the follow-on news conference, Maduro did, and his wife, they were both apprehended. They did try to escape. They tried to get to this kind of safe room with steel and reinforced doors and everything, but they didn't get there in time. And so it was a really precise operation, and it could have went wrong in a variety of ways, and then they wouldn't have probably got him then. Now, once in custody, they flew Maduro and his wife to a warship off the coast of Venezuela, and then they took him to Guantanamo for a while, and then they finally transported him to Brooklyn to face charges. Now, lastly, it is important to note that this action only removed Venezuela's leader from power, but left the rest of the regime in place. And so this is another sort of marker of some of the limits that the Trump administration is kind of strategically imposing on itself to kind of avoid some of the pitfalls that they have seen in previous interventions, right? And so in a news conference after Maduro's capture, but they left the regime in place, right? And so even right away in the news conference after Maduro's capture, President Trump quickly dismissed the idea of a broader, kind of more systemic regime change by rejecting the Maria Machado, who is this well-known Venezuelan opposition leader, as the prospective successor to Maduro. Machado is well known and has won the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize for her work to try to bring down the Maduro government and oppose his authoritarian regime. But Trump claimed from the very beginning that she did not have the support or the respect of the Venezuelan people. Instead, he opted to support the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, who was sworn in as president with the support of the United States. The Trump administration has stated that it expects this new president to follow the policy directives of the United States. And it should be noted here, and I just saw this today or last night that Maria Machado is actually going to visit President Trump at the White House. And she has, in the run-up to this, I don't know if you saw this story, everybody has, right? She offered to give Donald Trump something that he highly prizes, and that is she wanted to give him his Nobel Peace Prize. And so she might win back a little favor with that gesture. He seems pretty pleased about that. The Nobel Committee said she can't do that. By the way, that's not allowed.
Yeah.
But who knows?
The New York Times had an anonymous source. Did you see this?
I did not.
Quoting an administration official said that once she accepted the Nobel Prize, knowing that Trump wanted it, that he was never going to sign off on her being the leader of Venezuela.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's an unnamed source.
Yeah.
Right.
Way to spread rumors.
It's the New
He
York
got it on Reddit.
No, come on. So now it wasn't on Reddit, it was in the New York Times. It was an anonymous source, so be skeptical of, if you want to be of that, that's fine. All right. So now we're gonna move to
No,
discussing
it was probably on TikTok. That's where you got it.
discussing some of the legal and constitutional issues raised by the U.S. attack on Venezuela and the capture of its country's leader. The conflict in Venezuela has highlighted a central tension in the conduct of U.S. foreign policy that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about in the next few weeks, namely which branch of Congress, the president or Congress, can legally authorize military force against another state and really drive U.S. foreign policy. This debate has long existed before Donald Trump was elected president. However, the recent actions of Trump in Venezuela have pushed the boundaries of the expanded war powers of the president, and shown again the declining ability of Congress to act as a check on executive authority when it comes to deploying military force to advance U.S. global political objectives. Now, the first point of contention regarding the constitutional legality of the Trump administration's intervention in Venezuela is that it did not get the approval of Congress before using military force to remove the president from power. President Trump notified the so-called Gang of Eight, the top Republican and Democratic leaders of the House and Senate Representatives, plus the chairs and ranking members of the intelligence committees of the two chambers, but only did so after the operation had begun. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives the power to formally declare war solely to Congress. Various Democratic Party lawmakers and legal experts have argued that the United States' actions in Venezuela were an act of war, and thus at the least required pre-approval from Congress, if not a formal declaration of war. However, the executive branch has claimed broad powers to order military operations without the approval of Congress based on Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution that designates the president as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So there is this tension between these two sets of constitutional powers. There are many historical precedents in which the president has engaged in military conflict without a formal declaration of war from Congress. You can think about the wars in Korea, Vietnam, at least the beginning of the war in Vietnam, Afghanistan and Iraq. Moreover, both Democratic and Republican presidents also have more limited uses of force against foreign nations with the intent of removing their leaders from power. For example, President Bill Clinton used military force against Serbia, which led to the overthrow of its president, Slobodan Milosevic. Perhaps the closest historical analogy to Venezuela occurred in 1989 when President George H.W. Bush ordered the invasion of Panama to arrest its president, Manuel Noriega, for drug trafficking. Bush also did not secure pre-approval from Congress for that operation.
So, there has been some historical analogies. The Trump administration defended its decision not to inform Congress before the attack on a couple of grounds. First, it argued that the intervention in Venezuela was not an act of war, but instead was a law enforcement action to bring a leader who was indicted for crimes against the United States to face charges. Now, they argued that the use of military forces was a necessary complement to this mission to protect law enforcement officers and ensure their safety. Now, this is a slippery slope argument that many people have questioned, right? You could now pretty much attack a whole range of countries if they face criminal charges. But it should be noted that a very similar argument was made by President George H.W. Bush's administration in 1989 when it came to Panama. And there's actually, and I looked it up, a brief by a member of the Department of Justice, Bill Barr. You remember Barr? Mm-hmm. He wrote a whole thing about how it is legal for the United States to go into other countries and arrest people for crimes in the United States, and to use the military to protect those who arrest them. So they didn't come up with this argument. This is something that they have used in the past. So essentially, the intervention in Venezuela may be just one more example of a president launching a military attack without congressional input beforehand. However, what I would like to point out here is that there is one way that U.S. law, namely the War Powers Act, may actually constrain future military action in Venezuela, especially if it entails long-term presence of American forces on the ground in that country. Now, the War Powers Act requires that the president report to Congress within 48 hours of deploying American troops in armed combat. The Trump administration has abided by that constraint throughout the crisis in Venezuela. They've reported to Congress when they started attacking boats within 48 hours. They reported to Congress within 48 hours when attacking mainland Venezuela and capturing and extracting Maduro. But more importantly, this War Powers Act also forbids armed forces from remaining in a foreign conflict without congressional authorization for the use of force. Now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio seemed to acknowledge, maybe unintentionally, this constraint when he defended the Trump administration's right to attack Venezuela to extract Maduro without getting pre-approval. Because his response was, at the time, this wasn't an invasion. We didn't occupy the country, which, of course, then suggests that if the United States does engage in an invasion and does occupy the country, then it would need to get a congressional authorization for the use of force. And arguably, some Republican senators seem to agree that President Trump would need to get this type of congressional authorization for future military action in Venezuela. On January 8th, 5 Republican senators joined all the Democrats in the Senate in an important Senate vote on constraining future military interventions in Venezuela. This procedural vote moved the measure to a final vote that is still pending. And if passed, this would be a rare example of Congress actually voting on the record to constrain the president's war powers. Now, the action is largely symbolic, most likely, because the bill would have to also get passed by the House of Representatives, which is pretty unlikely, but it's not impossible, I would say.
No, and the Republican majority is razor thin.
Razor thin. But then for this to become a law, it would have to be signed by President Trump. Now, that's not going to happen. Yeah. And so that's not going to go on the books. But we already have on the books the War Powers Act. And so this does signal that in the future, if there is military action taken by the Trump administration, there could very well be a congressional debate and a vote on a new authorization of the use of military force, or AUMF, as it relates to Venezuela. And so that's, I think, something to watch for as this continues. Now, there is one final point on this particular debate that needs to be pointed out, and that is President Trump's attitude regarding constraints on his powers to use military power and conduct U.S. foreign policy unilaterally. In some comments from a recent interview with the New York Times, the president has suggested that there are no legal, constitutional, or institutional constraints on his war powers. And I think it's important to quote directly the exchange in the interview with the New York Times at length. So here it goes. I'm going to play 2 roles here for you. Okay. Pat, check my, So the reporter asks, Do you see any checks on your power on the world stage? Is there anything that could stop you if you wanted to? Trump says, yeah, there is one thing. My own morality, my own mind. It's the only thing that can stop me, and that's very good. The reporter then asks, not international law? And Trump says, I don't need international law. I'm not looking to hurt people. I'm not looking to kill people. Thoughts? This is an interesting.
I was hoping we were going to get a better Trump imitation from you.
I couldn't do it. I was practicing and I couldn't. This is I would say this is an unusual articulation by a president, suggesting that there's very few institutional constraints. I think though that the trend in U.S. foreign policy has been that a lot of presidents might not say this, but I think at least conduct policy relatively close to this. I think it goes further, but I'm not sure how much further it goes. What do you think?
I think this is an incredible statement, right?
Well, I think it is, but it's because it was uttered out loud.
Yes, but this, I mean, so the way I think, I can remember going to a talk from the Strauss Center here at UT, maybe, I don't know, 14 or 15 years ago, where there were former Bush officials talking about the war in Iraq and the tensions associated with this, the congressional pushback, and there was a conversation about at what point were the lawyers in the room with respect to weapons of mass destruction, and the argument, well, there were always lawyers in the room, and when they didn't listen to their lawyers enough, that's when they got into trouble. And so even Bush did things that, I mean, there was still congressional authorization for that war.
Yeah, there was.
But there was still, yes, there's the executive branch in that case was doing what it wanted, fighting an unpopular war that got increasingly unpopular, but he was reelected in 2004 and the American public supported that. But there wasn't this blatant disregard for law in most of its forms. And the idea that, no, I don't need to, I mean, I mean, they reused these AUMFs. I mean, that was, like, that were 20 years old.
Yeah.
Who did?
Donald Trump did before him.
No, but I think, I mean, that quote, in a sense, basically saying international law doesn't apply, law doesn't apply. I am my own legal and moral code. That's not normal for presidents to say.
No, it's not normal to say.
Yeah. I'm
just not sure that there's a lot no one else would say that. What I'm suggesting is that some have not really embraced the concrete checks on them. They constantly fight congressional input, and so this is my point. Is more like this is the point. This is how far we've come, and so. We'll see. All
right, so now we're going to talk with the goals of the Trump administration now in Venezuela. And so, in some sense, what have they talked publicly about? What are they? This is important because Trump has said, quote, that the United States plans on running the country. So what is that plan from post-Maduro Venezuela? So we're going to start this section with another clip from the PBS NewsHour. So let's go ahead and roll that clip.
In Palm Beach today, after he and his team watched the operation unfold overnight, President Trump announced the operation was not only about regime change.
We are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
President Trump said Secretary of State Marco Rubio had spoken to Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, who was sworn in to replace Maduro.
She had a long conversation with Marco, and she said, we'll do whatever you need. I think she was quite gracious, but she really doesn't have a choice.
But at least publicly today, Rodriguez rejected that.
La inmediata liberación We demand the immediate release of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. The only president of Venezuela is President Nicolas Maduro.
And President Trump made clear part of the plan was to take Venezuela's oil. The country has the world's largest oil reserves, which the U.S. helped develop exactly 1 century ago. But former leader Hugo Chavez kicked out some U.S. and other foreign energy companies, and today the industry produces a fraction of its capacity.
We're going to be replacing it, and we're going to take a lot of money out so that we can take care of the country.
But the president made clear today was not only about Venezuela. This was about displaying an ability and willingness to enforce regional domination and embracing the early 19th century declaration by President Monroe to block foreign colonialism in the Americas.
They now call it the Monroe Document. I don't know. Under our new national security strategy, American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again.
Rubio made clear the next possible target.
Yeah, look, if I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned.
And to critics who question whether a president who was elected in part to avoid foreign entanglements.
Why is running a country in South America America first?
Well, I think it is because we want to surround ourselves with good neighbors. We want to surround ourselves with stability. We want to surround ourselves with energy. We have tremendous energy in that country.
Regime change not for democracy, but for energy and for its own sake. As the question tonight in Caracas and perhaps around the world. Now what?
All right, so let's discuss these goals in a bit more detail, other than stay out of Havana, I guess, right? The first point to make is that the Trump administration has articulated several, sometimes competing goals in Venezuela. Which of these goals becomes the primary mission will go a long way in determining whether and how American military power will be used in Venezuela. At the beginning of the conflict with Venezuela, the primary goal for the United States was countering narco-terrorism. The attacks on Venezuelan vessels suspected of engaging in drug trafficking was justified by an argument that the flow of drugs from Venezuela represented a national security threat to the United States due to the number of American deaths from drug overdoses. Many experts question this assertion, claiming that the drug problem in the United States was not driven by cocaine from Venezuela, but rather fentanyl from countries such as China and Mexico. Moreover, drug trafficking was deemed a law enforcement operation rather than a national security threat, requiring intervention by U.S. military forces. The Trump administration still contends that combating drug trafficking is a major goal of American actions in Venezuela, and argues that the removal of Maduro will allow the U.S. to directly mandate counter narcotics policy with a more compliant Venezuelan government. However, this goal has been overshadowed by other goals that have been publicly talked about after the capture of Maduro. The removal of Maduro from power brought the goal of regime change in Venezuela squarely on the table. However, removing the top leadership does not automatically produce regime change. This requires reprogramming a country's institutions, including its military, to change the country's behavior. The Trump administration does not seem interested in this type of full-scale regime change, at least right now. Rather than supporting the opposition leader, Maria Machado, as the rightful successor to Maduro, the Trump administration has championed Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, and left other top military leaders in place as well. Regime change, especially if it entails a democratic transition and new and free and fair elections, is a more difficult and risky endeavor than trying to control the authoritarian regime that's already in place. Such a project would likely mean taking on Venezuelan military and armed groups called colectivos that run daily life on the ground. This likely would take a long-term American military investment and presence. Trump has rejected the idea embraced by prior presidents like George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden that the United States should have a foreign policy that includes support for democracy and human rights. However, this may also be a strategically pragmatic move as well, designed to avoid the types of long-term military occupation that Trump has long criticized. There's also a third broader strategic goal that's at play in U.S. actions against Venezuela: enhancing American hegemony over the Western Hemisphere. This strategic goal has been dubbed the Monroe Doctrine, and this refers to President Trump's determination to reestablish the Monroe Doctrine, the policy articulated by President James Monroe in the early years of the American Republic that declared that the United States would be a hegemon of the Western Hemisphere and would view European colonization or intervention as hostile acts. Trump's Monroe Doctrine aims at building a U.S. sphere of influence in Central and South America, and Venezuela could be the first example of how this policy will be carried out on the ground. It also helps to explain why other potential targets of U.S. intervention, such as Greenland and Cuba, have been mentioned as potential next targets of expanded U.S. influence and hegemony. Now, finally, control over Venezuela's oil industry is also on the table, and it has emerged as a primary goal for the Trump administration. So we're going to cover this goal in the next section.
Which is right now.
Yeah.
So we're going to drill down, pun
intended, yes.
That's right, a bit more on the goal that seems to be emerging as the primary mission of the Trump administration, at least for now, in Venezuela, and that's control over Venezuela's oil industry. And so we're going to start with a short clip from the New York Times, and so let's roll that clip now.
And if one thing has been clear, President Trump is very focused on extracting more of Venezuela's oil.
The oil business in Venezuela has been a bust. They were pumping almost nothing by comparison to what they could.
Now, the world's largest oil producer is targeting the country with the world's biggest oil reserves. The United States has more than 80 billion barrels of oil reserves, compared to Venezuela's more than 300 billion. Back in 1997, Venezuela produced almost 5% of the world's oil. Venezuela now produces around 1%. The decline in Venezuela stems in part from infrastructure that has fallen into disrepair, from refineries to pipelines to the tanks that the country uses to store oil. President Trump has a vision for repairing this infrastructure.
We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars.
But he can't do that unilaterally. The businesses we are talking about are private and are making their own decisions. Several factors will affect whether they want to return to Venezuela. There's the political environment and the stability in the country, the terms of investment, and how certain companies are that if they go back, they will be able to stay there.
Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit. The first point about the attraction of the Trump administration to the oil industry in Venezuela is the most obvious one. Venezuela has an enormous amount of oil under the ground. It has enormous oil reserves. Thus, it's not surprising from a certain perspective that the United States, which is now the world's largest oil exporter, to desire control over Venezuela, which has the world's largest oil reserves. Such a move would make the United States a dominant global player in the world energy markets. The specific potential benefits to the United States of control over Venezuelan oil are numerous. It could expand the United States' ability to project power around the world without worrying quite as much about the economic and political consequences of oil price shocks. It could reduce the influence of other major oil producers like Russia, an adversary, and countries in the Middle East, which have been adversaries or are troublesome allies for the United States. And it could leave big consumers of oil, like China, more dependent on the United States. It could also increase, and it seems this might be one of the strategies here, it could also just increase the supply of oil on the global market, which could then decrease the price of gasoline in the United States, reducing President Trump's biggest domestic problem of inflation and affordability. Of course, though, there are potential risks and potential downsides, and there's an ethical decision of just taking over a country's natural resources, right? That has been long held kind of critique of American interventions in the past. In the Middle East, the United States was always accused of going after Middle East oil when it intervened in Iraq, and is constantly being accused of that sort of behavior. So, what are those risks? The first risk for the United States is a financial one, an economic one. It's the high cost of rebuilding the oil infrastructure of Venezuela, which has been estimated, but this is really, I think, still just a guess, as something as high as $100 billion to rebuild that infrastructure. There is a reluctance of U.S. oil companies to invest that much money in a place that they have invested in prior eras and saw their assets seized through nationalization. And so there is a long-term commitment problem in a way that might make them reluctant to invest. There's also the idea that there's going to be security problems of doing business in Venezuela. And so addressing these concerns produce a lot of risks. They could necessitate, if the United States is actually going to convince these oil companies to invest that much money in Venezuela, it could mean that that's what triggers a broader American financial and even military presence in the country to on the ground run the country the way that they need to in order to make sure that you can invest and extract the oil at scale. And that could mean American troops on the ground, instability in the country, because this isn't going to be legitimate for the Venezuelan people. One of the reasons that it turned to a more leftist regime was this populist kind of natural resource nationalism in which they found the original American investments in Venezuelan oil and the American companies profiting at such large scale as unfair. And so this would cause a lot of problems. And if this kind of instability with American troops on the ground resulted in American casualties and a forever war, that is a huge risk. And so those are the goals set out, right? They're competing. They're not all in line with each other. We're going to end this lecture by taking a step back to examine this operation more holistically and try to look at some potential benefits and the many risks of the U.S. military intervention in Venezuela. And we're going to start with this segment with one final clip from the New York Times, this Times opinion columnist Nicholas Kristof. And let's roll that clip now.
If you're feeling contradictory about all this, join the crowd. I look at what unfolded in Venezuela and frankly, I feel some contradictions. On the one hand, I've reported in Venezuela and Nicolas Maduro was a dictator. He was oppressive. He mismanaged the economy. He was a disaster for Venezuela and for the entire region. There are approximately 7.9 million refugees who fled Venezuela, going to Colombia, to other countries, impoverished. In a country that has so much oil wealth because of mismanagement there. Venezuela and the entire region would be much better off with Maduro out if he is replaced by somebody better. Yet at the same time, if we're going to question Maduro's legitimacy, as we should, look, he appears to have lost the last presidential election, we also have to look at the legitimacy of the U.S. operation to remove him. And there's serious doubts about the legality of that. Right now, I'm talking to you from Taiwan, where one has to wonder whether Xi Jinping and China will look at operations like this and think, well, if the U.S. can do that in Venezuela, then why can't I do that in Taiwan? So, we have to look at that precedent. We have to look at the legality of what we have done. And then we have to look at the practical impact of this. If Maduro could be replaced in Venezuela by a democratic government that could manage the economy well, that would be great for Venezuela. But note that the Venezuelan vice president is still there. The Cubans who surround Maduro appear to still be there. So it's not clear that the regime has been overthrown at all. In fact, it seems to still be in place, even if Maduro himself is gone. And I think we should also remember that we have some experience in helping remove dictators, including in Iraq and in Libya, and finding that it is a lot easier to topple a dictator than to institute a democratic populist government in its place. Look, I think it's worth celebrating the ouster of a harsh dictator. I think it's important to raise serious questions about how that was done. I think it's important to yearn for a better Venezuela, and yet hold realistic doubts about whether today's operation will actually accomplish that.
Yeah, so I found this clip and I put it in here because I do think that it kind of represents these tensions here. And so what I'm going to start here is with sort of my overview position on this, and that is that this was a war. I'll just call it a war because it was a military operation that removed the leader of a foreign government and used military force to do it. It was a war of choice. The United States could have easily not done any of the military interventions, including intercepting boats and destroying them to stop the drug trade, as a national security operation. There wasn't a significant national security threat that forced this action. And so when you have these kinds of decisions that are conflicts of choice, then the judgment on that conflict, because you didn't have to do it, will always be determined by the very uncertain future outcome that it takes. If it turns out that Venezuela develops into a even relatively democratic and relatively more prosperous place that is less of a threat to the region, then this will be deemed a decent decision. But if it doesn't, then it will become the debacle that, Iraq is seen as, right? And so at the time, there was a similar kind of debate when Saddam Hussein was removed, right? Saddam Hussein was a harsh dictator. Nicolas Maduro is a harsh dictator. And so if you go through the potential benefits of this action, they're pretty easy to see. People usually don't have a whole lot of sympathy for ruthless dictators that kill people, drive them out of the country, ruin economies, and make life miserable, right? I don't have any sympathy for Nicolas Maduro. He was a terrible leader, right? But removing that dictator only becomes a long-term benefit for the country that it was targeted, but also for the United States if it's replaced by something else, right? And so the only way this becomes a good outcome is if the dream scenario turns out. We removed Maduro, there's some sort of regime change that includes competitive elections, and there's some sort of rebuilding of the Venezuelan economy based on oil or something else that makes it more prosperous, less of a basket case. And that then those benefits will spill over to benefits for not only Venezuela, but the whole region and U.S.-Venezuelan relationships. That was the dream in Iraq, too. If Iraq became a democracy in the middle of the Middle East, that was the Bush vision. That could be a beacon that could make even more positive change in that region. None of that happened. Okay. And so that's the potential benefits, but the risks, in my opinion, far outweigh the likelihood that dream scenario is going to happen.
Can I push back a little bit on the idea that there are benefits? And I would just push back slightly by saying, right, when we're talking about benefits for whom? And, on the one hand, if the U.S. has more access to Venezuelan oil, could that help the American economy? Sure. But it's hard it's hard for me to not understand the benefits in terms of the distributional consequences of these. So yes, this could help the Trump coalition, this could help oil companies, but then who shoulders the cost of that, right? And so if the U.S., right, has these, and I think we just take them at face value, that oil is important, and you talked about, and right, the oil executives have already said, we need long-term commitments to our property rights before we're going to start making investments that we measure in billions of dollars. Well,
and the return doesn't come for at least 10 or longer years.
What happens if Trump is not? Trump is not the president after 2028, will there still be a commitment by the next president to honor these things? The oil executives are going to think about that. But then we also have to ask, and this goes to what you were talking in terms about securing potentially or enabling regime change in Venezuela that approaches something along the lines of democracy. Do we need greater American military investments to protect the groups in Venezuela that support democracy, right?
Well, that becomes a conflict.
Yes, and what I'm saying there, then we are extending, then it becomes much harder to talk about the benefits of this operation, because now all of a sudden we are exposing Americans and Venezuelans and regional actors to more costs of the policy, right? What's striking to me is how this is a pretty significant break in terms of how American presidents talk about oil, right? And willingness to engage in territorial conquest, and that's what this is, right? I mean, it's holding out the threat of active U.S. military intervention to secure oil assets by first taking out the president. This is, if we look back at the conversation about Iraq in 2003, the Bush administration goes out of its way to say this is not about
oil.
This is about democracy. We're going to return the oil assets to the Iraqis. The other thing is, if we think about the first Persian Gulf War in 1991, why did President H.W. Bush, he goes to Congress and said, why are we going to war? We are preventing the concentration of oil capacity in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Because it would be, if he has Kuwaiti oil reserves, this would be bad for oil markets. And so they were protecting access. What is the U.S. doing here? U.S. is already the biggest manufacturer of oil in the world, and now secures access to, to the largest reserve of oils. This is exactly what George H.W. Bush was trying to prevent in 1990 and 91. And now we have a Republican successor to that president doing the exact opposite. Anyway, it's striking to me.
Well, the risks are myriad, right? And I think we've covered a lot of them. This could devolve into unrest and chaos in which, and again, that lesson isn't lost, right? When you remove these leaders, the examples there in terms of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, but Gaddafi in Libya, Assad in Syria, even in Eastern Europe, the removal of those authoritarian regimes all ended up in chaos and internal domestic violence and civil war. And so that could be an outcome of this. And that would be worse. It's not the same. It's worse than a harsh dictator.
And if we're thinking about what the administration's goals are, what's a lesson from Syria and the chaos from Syria? It created a massive refugee problem and a migration problem.
Right. And migration always is underlying this too.
Yes, that people fleeing to Europe, that has remade European politics, right? It contributed to the rise of parties on the right. It contributed to Brexit. What's one of Trump's primary goals here? It's controlling the flow of borders. If you destabilize a major regional actor and potentially create the conditions for civil war, what's going to happen to the flow of people?
So
we're going to, anyway.
And so just because we got to close here, there's also other more international consequences. This does set a precedent of aggression, right? That could then be mirrored by China and Russia against Taiwan and well, it's already been done to Ukraine, right? And then there is the broader international reputation of the United States and its influence, and the sort of international system, and we'll be talking about this throughout the semester, the international system since World War II that was built by the United States that is designed to avoid these kinds of use of military force against foreign countries. And so, and the final thing is, if any of these really bad things happen, again, I'll go back to my original statement. The person who will be held responsible, whether they try to escape it or not, will be President Donald Trump and his administration and the Republican Party. And so this is an electoral and political risk as well, because, again, just like the effect that it had on the Republican Party and the presidency of George W. Bush after his second term, when things went sour in Iraq and Afghanistan, the same thing will happen here in the United States, and there'll be another reaction against, learning kind of the same lesson, I guess.
Yeah,
that this is dangerous, this is risky.
And again, that's going to, as Rob talked about, that's going to depend on on local conditions on the ground in Venezuela and how they evolve over the next 6 or 7 months. I think it's also, we can point out there too, yes, we had a few Republican senators that voted against Trump, but the coalition is holding firm, right?
Well, and they usually do, right? The coalition held firm in Iraq too. And there was a bipartisan coalition that was like gung-ho on that until it wasn't. Right? But there were electoral consequences.
Yes.
Bernie Sanders is Bernie Sanders today because he was one of the sole people speaking out against it. Same thing with Barack Obama.
That's how he separated
Hillary
from
Clinton in the 2008 primary, largely because of his, stand against that war. And so there'll be long-term consequences of all this.
Yes, and let's couple back. So this would be a way for Rob to push back on me when I push back at him in the introduction.
He's wrong.
No, it's just, no, we're not going to go that far. But in terms of this being a consequential event, its consequences will magnify, particularly for domestic politics, if there's greater instability in Venezuela over the next 6 to 7 months. And I would say that is probably a significant likelihood if the United States isn't going to do anything to stabilize or determine how the government there evolves. Basically, who's going to be in power.
Well, that's why a democratic transition, although very complicated, risky, etc., is the best chance for long-term stability in Venezuela. But short-term, it's not. Right? And that's the conflict. There's short-term and long-term goals, and it's hard to navigate those two things.
So I'm sure we're going to have a lot to talk about this semester. We're out of time.
Yeah.
But we'll see you in a couple of weeks.